Can I listen to your podcast?
All right. Welcome to Middle School Music, where old school meets new school. I'm one of your hosts, Farhan Lalji, and with me is Dario DeWet. Dario, how you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm so excited. There's been so much happening in the music space again. I say this every week, but I mean for real this time. I don't know if you remember from our last episode, we were talking about, do chart rankings really matter? And speaking about some of the contentious issues surrounding album releases and chart rankings. Well, Billboard's actually just set new rules for counting merchandise album bundles. So starting on January 3rd, 2020, album sales will only be counted as part of bundles if every item in the bundle is sold at the same time. And those items have to be sold individually on an artist's official direct-to-consumer website.
Interesting. So what do you think that's going to mean for some of the things that we've seen in the past in terms of with whether it was DJ Khaled or some of the other artists that we talked about? Do you think this would kind of massively change who ends up on top and how things get kind of ranked and scored?
Well, the change in rules won't alter the formula for album sales paired with concert tickets, and that's historically been actually the biggest driver to chart positions. Recently you've started with merchandise bundles, and even more, Billboard's now also introduced an additional rule saying that merchandise items and bundles must be sold for a lower price than the complete package. So any bundle must be priced at least $3.49 more than the lone merchandise item in order for it to qualify as an album sale on the charts.
Gotcha. It'll be interesting to see how artists try to kind of bend some of these rules to kind of maximize their kind of record sales in the future based on some of these rule changes as well.
It'll definitely start to happen, so I can't wait to see how this unfolds.
And speaking of Billboard and charts and numbers, we're also getting into music award season. We just had the AMAs, or the American Music Awards, with the winners kind of happening this week, a couple of days ago. Taylor Swift making some news in terms of getting, what was it? Artist of the whatever it was, kind of.
Artist of the Year.
Artist of the Year.
Yeah.
And also kind of throwing some shade at Scooter Braun with her choice in outfits in terms of wearing all the names of all of her past albums that she can't or she doesn't have some of the royalties and kind of the IP around anymore. So it was kind of interesting to see her choice in outfits and her performance. The Artist of the Year win was a bit surprising as well, I felt. What did you think about that?
Yeah, completely. She beat Drake, Ariana Grande, Halsey, and Post Malone. I personally don't think Taylor Swift's most recent album is that great. I guess the American public or the voting board feels differently. I would have expected that to have gone probably to Post Malone at this point in time. But overall, I think there were some great winners. You saw Billie Eilish winning New Artist of the Year, Collaboration of the Year, Shawn Mendes and Camila Cabello. Favorite male artist actually went to Khalid, and he beat out Drake and Post Malone. But did you know that the MTV European Music Awards were about 3 weeks ago?
Oh my God.
And
totally.
We completely went over our heads.
It's interesting, right? Like, because I think, kind of the awards aren't necessarily as kind of meaningful as maybe they once were. Like, I think especially with, we were talking earlier about stadium artists in a previous podcast and how we're seeing more and more kind of niche artistry kind of coming up. And I feel like you kind of care who you care about, right? So the impact of pop music doesn't feel as kind of like penetrating across all different audiences as maybe it did 10, 15, or even longer ago. Now, with kind of your Tyler, the Creators, or your Frank Oceans, or even kind of more niche artists, people don't necessarily care as much about who wins a pop music award. And saying that, I mean, we've just also had the Grammys announced as well in terms of the nominees. I was quite interested to see that actually I felt the new music category, the new artist category was a lot broader than the American Music Awards, right? So you had groups like the Black Pumas, you had Maggie Rogers, Rosalia, kind of a couple of artists that I'm not too familiar with in Tank and the Bengas and Yola, but you had some really interesting artists coming up, and I felt like the American Music Awards had more kind of your typical kind of pop numbers in that category, at least.
Yeah, completely. I think the Grammys is doing a better job, I think, at diversifying in their selection process. I see Dr. Dre is being awarded or recognized, I think, for a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice to kind of see, Dre, even though maybe from the music side, yes, on the production piece with Kendrick and others, but he's somebody who's got like a lot of previous experience and stuff that, kind of maybe 10, 15 years ago, seeing one of the hip hop pioneers as getting this lifetime achievement award, maybe it would have been a little bit more of an out there kind of guess to see somebody like Dre getting that award. But it's nice to see the Grammys actually becoming a little bit more broader in their reach.
Completely. I think something just to highlight, though, if we were to compare or contrast the Grammys versus the American Music Awards versus the MTV European Music Awards, is, people say, oh, no one watches MTV. I don't buy that argument, because the American Music Awards created a spectacle through its live performances. You had Taylor Swift perform with Halsey and Camila Cabello. You had Post Malone do his track with Travis Scott and Ozzy Osbourne. They almost burnt the stadium down, the venue down. These are encapsulating performances that are so memorable, and they are widely distributed on social media. Can you name one that the MTV EMAs actually did? No. Whereas MTV was renowned for creating controversy. I guess that was part of the success of someone like Eminem's career, was his relationship with MTV. And I think that even the Grammys, they're starting to become more inclusive, which is important. And you will probably also start to see some very dynamic and thrilling performances across genre, maybe some collaborations that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like we've seen with Kendrick Lamar and Imagine Dragons in the past, as an example.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if an artist like Lizzo, who's been nominated, for Best Pop Solo, for Best Song, and for Best New Artist, to see if she kind of maybe digs in the crates and who kind of comes along and performs with her. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the music industry. We've got awards that we've talked about, the new categorization, but what are we talking about this week in terms of our one big thing, Dario?
So this week we're talking about lyrics and law. So it's the controversial use of lyrics as evidence. And we're not just talking about rap.
Yeah, we're going to go into rock. We're going to go into the history of things like the explicit lyrics and adult warnings that have happened in the U.S. For multiple decades now. So I can't wait to dig in. So shall we kind of explore that topic?
Let's kick it off.
All right. So lyrics and law. This is something that's been going on almost for as long as I've been alive, but it's really kind of come into the spotlight more recently with the Tekashi 6ix9ine stuff that's been in the news. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit more and give them some context around what's been happening with Tekashi?
Sure. So Tekashi 6ix9ine, I'm sure most of you are aware, Daniel Hernandez, SoundCloud rapper, rose to fame with his music, who had been testifying in the court in the US against the 9 Trey Gangsta Bloods, which is the gang he associated himself with. He's basically committed a crime in itself by snitching in the hip hop community. So I guess for a reduced sentence, which will have implications outside of jail time in itself within the communities. But I think the point to highlight here really, though, is that at one point prosecutors asked him about the lyrics for his hit song Gamo, and whether any words in that song included any threats against rivals, which, he kind of gave a wishy-washy answer saying, it's a song towards somebody who I don't get along with. I don't know. I thought it was cool at the time. But this opens up a huge can of worms.
Yeah, and this isn't like something that's been, kind of new to hip-hop and to music in general, right? I mean, for hip-hop heads, the NWA, F the Police, with the FBI, and getting everyone excited around kind of the law in terms of police and NWA is probably the thing that most people will point to and remember as a time when law enforcement got heavily involved in the music industry. But I think even 10 years prior to the NWA stuff, you had court cases with Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbourne in kind of the hard rock, heavy metal side of things, where they were kind of their lyrics were used as insightful hate speech, where they were talking about suicide. And a lot of young, impressionable teenagers who were probably dealing with other things were listening to Judas Priest, were listening to Ozzy Osbourne and taking their lives. And so the courts were challenging how the influence of Judas Priest, how the influence of Ozzy Osbourne was having an impact on these young, impressionable teenagers. Many of you might know, or some of you might know about Tipper Gore, who's the wife of the former vice president and presidential candidate Al Gore. But she was quite influential in terms of taking what was happening in the music industry and ensuring that record labels, as well as distributors, as well as retail establishments, put on that explicit lyrics, parental advisory stuff. So that was kind of her role. She did that as kind of going to the Senate in the U.S. Alongside the wife of another senator, Susan Baker, who was the wife of James Baker or Jim Baker. They did a lot of this. And then, kind of Two Live Crew was also in the late 80s, early 90s, and they were pushing it even further. So it became a sense of, well, this isn't just explicit. This is almost violent or misogynistic or all of these other things that people had a real issue with. And the Two Live Crew thing actually went really, really far up to the Supreme Court, where they were challenging the indecency of those lyrics. I mean, Me So Horny and, other things that the Two Live Crew, I mean, that's probably the one I can get away with on a podcast like this. There's a lot of lyrics that Two Live Crew did that were outright misogynistic, but they were putting on an act, right? They were kind of reflecting society as they knew it from the Miami urban scene. You had artists that we know now as kind of quite clean cut in terms of like LL Cool J, who also had been arrested in Georgia for indecency with, you wouldn't kind of listen to it now and think so, but I Need Love, which is one of LL Cool J's ultimate slow jams, he was basically arrested for indecency because of his live performance of that event. And if you contrast that with NWA being arrested for performing F the Police in Detroit, rap probably had a huge impact in terms of taking things that were already an issue and turning it into a real societal contemplation around how do we evaluate, how do we assess the impact that these lyrics are having on youth and on other kind of societal factors and segments as well. And more recently, I think now you're seeing that kind of transition into, kind of gangster rap from NWA saying F the Police. That transition through to Tekashi, there's been lots of incidences. The one that I kind of point to as a kind of a turning point was there was an artist on the No Limit kind of record label called Mac Phipps who was arrested and kind of convicted he was convicted for 30 years for murder, not because the evidence was clear that he actually did commit the murder, but because the police took some sample lyrics of his from two of his songs, put them together, and kind of gave that evidence in court in order to convict him of a crime that more and more people today believe that he didn't commit. And that's still being kind of fought in the courts today, I believe, to kind of overturn that wrongful conviction.
I think something to highlight is that rap lyrics are typically used in three main ways. So they're either treated as confessions if they're written after the crime, they're treated as proof of intent if they're written before the crime, or they're classified as threats, and the lyrics being the crime themselves. So the issue is, in the US legal system, you have a jury, and by using lyrics in these ways, you're manipulating the jury. And the law doesn't give judges the authority to ban evidence. So you're
kind of skirting around the edges, right? Like you're kind of like taking the law and playing it almost in a way that maybe, the people who wrote some of those laws didn't intend for it to be actually used. It's interesting to see how different this becomes, right? Because in the cases of Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest and even maybe Marilyn Manson, right, there was that almost like urging of others to commit violent actions. And then when others did commit violent actions, there was some account to be held. Whereas in a lot of these other more recent hip-hop related, and violence related or gang related kind of issues, there's been more of a direct impact as kind of the rappers in question are themselves being accused of these crimes. And it's interesting how you say that, it's either the lyrics themselves as a threat or kind of the afterwards side of things happening. Do you have some explicit kind of examples where this has kind of been the case?
For sure. Before I get into that, I just want to highlight, though, that, with the likes of SoundCloud and YouTube and the fact that it's so easy to upload songs yourself, even Genius, there are more lyrics available than ever before for police and for people in the legal space to troll the internet, and to actually...
It's almost crime discovery.
Exactly. So you can basically paint your case in any way, shape, or form that you wish.
That's really sad as well because I think the legal institution, especially in the U.S., is a numbers driven game, right? So a lot of prosecutors have to try to kind of make numbers in terms of how many people they arrest or how many people they put in kind of the legal system or are able to convict. And when you have crimes like this, when you can point to lyrics as a result, and as lyrics become a trend, so more and more even like kind of wannabe gangsters or maybe kind of putting those lyrics out, they're kind of exposing themselves as potential convictees for some of these prosecutors who are on the hunt.
Sure, and something to highlight before I go into these cases is, gangster rap maybe isn't as commercial as it used to be back, maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, but it's still very relevant to people within certain subcultures because it resonates with society.
Thank God for emo rap.
Well, even actually something quickly before we go into these cases is you've got emo rap, like Lil Peep, who died of a Xanax overdose. I mean, these guys are encouraging, or Lil Xan, they're encouraging and promoting drug use. When is the time going to come that somebody who's a big fan of theirs, passes away from a drug overdose, and someone scans through their Spotify, their SoundCloud, their Instagram, whatever it is, and sees, well, actually, they were a massive fan of one of these artists, and then those people get prosecuted.
Yeah, that's really interesting because even artists whose lyrics might not be so obviously towards either depression or mental health issues, like Love, who I'm a big fan of, who's not a hip hop artist, but is more of a dance pop artist. He deals a lot with kind of feeling depressed in his music, and how he's dealing with it is in a positive kind of way when you look at the lyrics in whole. But unfortunately, not everybody has that kind of context or takes the time to kind of see the message, right? So I think that's a great point, that actually you could take a snippet of even a Love lyric and point to how that could influence somebody to taking action in that way.
Completely. So just a couple cases here, and we're neutral on these decisions, but just to kind of give some context, you had a Texas rapper by the name of Tay K, who murdered one individual in 2016 and is now facing 55 years of prison because during sentencing, prosecutors introduced the video and lyrics for The Race, which is a music video of his, as well as the cover of his EP, Living Like Larry, which then depicted the 16-year-old rapper holding a gun. And, this exacerbated the overall sentencing. The same thing applies to YNW Melly, who released Murder on My Mind 1.5 years earlier than when he shot and killed 2 associates of his. He's currently facing the death penalty, and there are a variety of other rappers or lesser known rappers that we can go into here. You could look at NBA Youngboy, or kind of renamed Youngboy Never Broke Again, which was an interesting case because the Louisiana judge said your genre has a lot to do with the mindset people have, and your genre has normalized violence. And this highlights something interesting because it's the fact that somebody can generalize and point to the fact that, it's hip hop's fault or the genre of music's fault for crime is ludicrous. I mean, maybe that type of that way of thinking or thought process may have been more relevant during the times of NWA with F the Police, but in 2019, I don't know. I don't really buy it.
It's hard because in one way you could say it's inciting, but on the other side, it's actually a reflection, right? These are kind of the communities. These are the kind of backgrounds of some of these people that are coming through this. And it's not just music, right? So, and it's not just the US. So when we look at another kind of really recent thing, there's a gang movie in the UK called Blue Story, and there's been brawls in the cinemas where this movie has shown. Now, the movie is a realistic reflection, as you might kind of consider Top Boy. I mean, Top Boy is maybe on the extreme side. I don't know if the gun violence in the UK is as much as Top Boy tries to kind of proclaim. But at the same time, Blue Story is a more gritty, more kind of localized kind of view around kind of people in gangs. And the irony is that, it was kind of put together by somebody who actually escaped the gang wars. And now you're seeing kind of those gang brawls happening. So the question of, is art inciting this violence or is art reflecting this violence is a really important one for people to discuss. And this goes all the way back to your Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbournes, to your Loves, to your Marilyn Mansons, as well as your M&Ms and others, where people are actually reflecting their experiences and they're reflecting the stuff that they're seeing. I think where it becomes a fine line is where, kind of the artists themselves are being held to account for trying to kind of flow into that area where they're holding a gun and they're trying to look menacing and trying to build this character, and yet they're then being accosted for being that person, where maybe it's just an artist's portrayal of what criminal violence actually looks like, and maybe not the real thing. And I think that's the line that we have to be careful with.
Sure, I completely agree with that. And you mentioned Marilyn Manson. Well, Manson was accused for inciting or leading to the inspiration of the 1999 Columbine massacre in Colorado in the US, because it turns out that the shooters were Marilyn Manson fans. Something just which popped up into my head was, Jimmy Iovine had a tough time in the late 90s, early 2000s. You had Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails, you had Marilyn Manson, you were working with Dr. Dre, and then Eminem comes into the scene. I mean, causing untold havoc in society. To point to the likes of lyrics and how they're used against you, I mean, Eminem is a good example, and I know I talk about him a lot, but I guess, we tend to sometimes forget that he was sued by his mother for $10 million. He was then sued by his ex-wife, Kim, for the track Kim on the Marshall Mathers LP, where he talks about, murdering her. He's been investigated by George Bush in his song Marsh for hate speech against the President of the United States, and more recently by the Trump administration for, again, threats towards Trump and his family on the Revival album in 2017.
Yeah, it's interesting that Trump kind of suit hasn't made kind of more noise, right? Like, it's interesting that when Trump talks about like NBA players and sports athletes, I think that gets a lot more headlines than actually him filing lawsuits against the likes of Eminem. It's interesting that we're seeing that, right? And in Eminem's case, it's a real kind of reflection on his own personal kind of experiences, right? With direct relationships. In a lot of these other artists' case, it's a reflection of what they're seeing in society. And I think this is where the courts struggle, is drawing that line between an artist kind of reflecting what they see and an artist actually having that experience. I mean, there's no doubt that Tekashi 6ix9ine was involved in some sketchy kind of gang-related activities, but there are other artists that are on the peripheral kind of side or the periphery of gang violence who are basically telling the story, are reflecting what they're seeing, and then they're being prosecuted almost intentionally and maliciously to kind of make a point about how rap is actually inciting this, whereas I look at it as art is kind of reflecting this. It's interesting to see in the US, whether it's gang games or games around kind of Grand Theft Auto or whatever else it might be, that the courts and the media are more likely to look at those as kind of inciting behavior rather than kind of looking at the underlying availability of guns and availability and kind of lack of police control over some of these, or police engagement with some of these communities, right, as well. So I don't think we want to go too hard into that stuff.
Yeah.
It can get quite emotional, but I think it is quite interesting to see that reflection of where do you draw the line between an artist reflecting what they see and an artist experiencing things, or an artist having experienced these things and actually being criminally negligent or criminally implicable in some of these kind of violent acts.
Yeah, completely. I think something just to be cognizant of is that, in the US and in multiple countries, actually, prosecutors have attributed lyrics from artists to a defendant. In California, you had somebody sample Dr. Dre lyrics, and in a myriad of other examples where people have pulled excerpts from songs from all genres, and they've suffered repercussions from that. And I think in today's transparent world and this social media world, where also everybody is quite sensitive with regards to what is said and heard, it can create some serious problems. So I think people just also need to be a bit more conscious as well as a fan, to sometimes be a little bit more thoughtful behind the choices they make in maybe quoting lyrics to seem cool. I mean, I know people used to do it when Facebook was popular. And I guess
when
now
Facebook was popular.
yeah, and now it doesn't really happen so much anymore, well, at least amongst my social circles, but I'm sure it still does in the younger generations.
Yeah, I mean, whether that's maybe like TikTok or whether it's other Twitter or other channels as well, I'm sure, and actually, I know some cases as well where, kind of the authorities are using Twitter and other kind of social media channels to discover people who are up to criminal activity, right? It's interesting to see how, somebody putting it in art is also being kind of attacked or is being kind of accused. I think, we had Tupac Shakur earlier on, as well as Biggie, who were kind of involved in some criminal activity, whether it was through gangs, whether it was through drug trade, as well. And it's interesting. I wonder if, the courts today had a new kind of Biggie album talking about the drug trade today been released, or even a Jay-Z album, from 20 years ago, popularized kind of the standing on the corner selling drugs. It'd be interesting to see how far the authorities would go with some of that lyrical content today.
Totally. I think it's something to keep an eye on, even if you're not that interested in the legal side of it. It's just, it holds a very thoughtful message. It's very thought provoking. Just in general, whether you're a fan, whether you're an artist, whether you're a professional in the legal or the music space.
I mean, what do you think about it, Dario? I mean, like personally, I think there needs to be a little bit more of a line drawn, right? And some kind of understanding that actually what is art and what is actual intent, right? I feel quite kind of emotional around kind of seeing some of these rap artists, but also some of these metal artists or hard rock artists from years ago who are putting out what I believe is a reflection of how they're feeling and how they're seeing other people feel. And I feel like the law is maybe overstepping some of their bounds in some of these cases. How do you view it?
Yeah, so I see it in two ways. On the one end, it's if you've committed murder, you've committed a crime, then you deserve to be punished for that, right? But if you are just putting music out there, and if you happen to be putting out music, and that's the case, and you can draw some form of correlation between the two, then so be it. Right. But you can't use that music to point fingers at somebody to justify that their sentence should be worse necessarily. But when it comes to music itself, I think that freedom of expression is so important. A lot of artists in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s wouldn't be the big names that they are if it weren't for a bit of controversy, because it's warts and all, that's life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the line is actually around kind of what is their actual behavior and what other evidence is there around those crimes, right? I mean, when Dre and Ice Cube and others were talking about F the police, they were really talking as young black men. They weren't talking as criminals. In fact, I believe the story is that Ice Cube was on his way to college, right? Dre was quite the smart, almost engineer, right, kind of talent. Yeah. These weren't people who were going around brandishing arms. I mean, maybe Eazy-E was a little bit sketchy in his behaviors, but really it was Dre and Cube who were doing a lot of the writing, who were doing a lot of the performing. And if you kind of contrast reality to their lyrics, you would see a wide divergence between who they were as people and what they were portraying or what they were reflecting in terms of what they saw in society. And I think the law has to do a better job of saying, okay, here's the evidence that so-and-so has committed this crime. And here maybe is some context around what that individual is like. Whereas I feel like it's reversed and they're seeing the lyrics are the evidence and the context is that they were maybe available to commit that crime. And I don't know if that's really the way we want laws to be prosecuting people.
So that was intense. So on a lighter note, let's talk about new music this week, because there's a lot. We had The Weeknd release a new track called Heartless on Wednesday, which was actually a nice change for once, instead of music always being released on Friday. It's a great track. I'm really excited for his new album. I know that he's also got a song called Electric that's coming out. He's in partnership with Mercedes-Benz to help promote their new EV. We've got two massive album releases this week. One from The Game, which is called Born to Rap. I've spoken about it before. It's been delayed multiple times. They had a listening party in Q3 of this year. It's quite a long album. It's supposedly 25 tracks. It's his last album to be released. He's gone independent. If I look at the feature list, though, and The Game's normally a guy who has some pretty solid features. He's got strong relationships with practically everybody in the industry. The feature list's a bit weird. He's got an opening track and a closing track with Ed Sheeran. The first kind of popular release from the album is Stainless featuring Anderson .Paak. But others that are involved in the album, he's got D-Smoke from Rhythm and Flow. He's got Chris Brown, 21 Savage, Nipsey Hussle, the late Nipsey Hussle. He's got Miguel and Travis Barker. And then he's kind of filled it up with some lesser known artists to me, probably more important or more relevant for the US, likes of Dom Kennedy, Red Cafe, and a few others Bryson Tiller, and a few others I won't really go into.
It's interesting to see that reflection of emerging artists and kind of established artists and also kind of poppy artists with the Ed Sheerans and the like. It's interesting you mentioned Ed Sheeran on the game side. The song that I've been kind of rinsing the most over the last week is the new Stormzy track featuring Burna Boy and Ed Sheeran, Own It. I can't get enough of that track. I think it's important to say as well that we're recording this on a Thursday, so there might be more new music on tomorrow. So we're going to try and kind of record at least one or two more podcasts this side of 2019, as well as other songs that I've been listening to quite a bit. Melanin from Ciara actually is featuring a pretty tight verse from Lupita Nyong'o.
No way.
Yeah, the Oscar-winning
no way.
Actress delivers some real fire on the Melanin track, as well as Maggie Rogers, who's nominated, as we mentioned earlier, for one of the best new artists in the Grammys coming up. She's got a new track, which is really, really cool. And if you reflect that with an established head, Paul McCartney also has a new song this week called Home Tonight, which actually I felt like is the most like a Paul McCartney Beatles track that I've heard in a really, really long time. So if you are a Beatles fan, Paul McCartney's new track Home Tonight is a pretty good one. On the UK side, Stefflon Don with Gecko, Dino, and Dappy, they have a song together called Link Up, which I also really enjoyed. Harry Styles, who hosted Saturday Night Live.
Yes, I forgot about.
He's released a new album. The first track actually is probably the song that I've enjoyed the most from a Harry Styles as a solo artist, called Watermelon Sugar. So
I like that one as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to see Harry Styles, I think, finally kind of discovering himself. I believe Liam and some of the others from One Direction have kind of gone on that journey. And it's nice to see Harry Styles kind of like finding his lane.
It looks like he's trying to do a bit of a Mick Jagger-esque type vibe, the album cover and everything. I see them advertising for it on the tube. But yeah, Watermelon Sugar is a great track. One of the album releases I'm really looking forward to, if you're a real old school hip hop head, Farhan, I think you might like this one, is Griselda is finally releasing their WWCD record on Friday, which is their first album release from Shady Records. Griselda comprises of West Side Gun, Conway the Machine, and Benny the Butcher. I mean, individually, their tracks are awesome. They call themselves the new kings in New York. I see Conway got pretty stroppy with Complex for not announcing the album release as something serious. But what I like about them is that they have not budged from their style. They don't care if they're not mainstream. They put out solid hip-hop. If you don't like it, you can take a walk. But, yeah.
Yeah, the last track I'll mention is Jhené Aiko and Big Sean, None of Your Concern, which is interesting because I think they've gone through their relationships ups and downs, and they've recorded this track together. That's getting a little bit of buzz, and I'll let you kind of Google to kind of discover what the story is between Jhené Aiko and Big Sean, because we're not that kind of show. But I think that's been a good kind of couple of weeks of music, and hopefully you hear some more for us in the next couple of weeks as well.
Totally. So I think one thought to leave you with before we go is that Post Malone's Hollywood's Bleeding won the American Music Awards Rap Hip Hop Album of the Year. However, only 12% of that album was rap. 11 of the 17 tracks have no rapping from Post Malone. And Post only raps more than he sings on I Know, which is 59.8% of the time.
Thank you for that insight, Dario. All right, well, that does it for episode 8 of Middle School Music, where old school meets new school. I've been Farhan Lalji with my co-host Dario DeWet. You can find us on Twitter at MDLSKL_music. You can find me on Twitter at Farhan Lalji. Dario, where can the good listeners find you?
It's the ultimate tongue twister. You can find me on Twitter on at Dario_DeWet with a W.
Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you guys next time. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Can I listen to your podcast?